All right, let's dive right in. We're about to tackle one of the most controversial, and honestly, one of the most misunderstood ideas in all of history, the Trinity. Is it something that was just invented centuries later? Or does the story go back much, much further than most of us realize? We're going to follow the clues and see exactly where they lead.
You've probably heard this one before, right? It's a super common critique, and it's basically the starting point for our whole investigation today. The popular idea is that back in 325 AD, a bunch of bishops just got together in a room and voted Jesus into divinity.
And this critique goes even deeper. It suggests that the original, pure, simple belief in one God that Jesus and his followers had, well, it got corrupted, hijacked by Greek philosophy and Roman politics to create this complex doctrine, all for the sake of power. That's the narrative we often hear, a simple faith corrupted.
But what if that's not the full story? What if that story is missing some of the most important chapters? What if the real clues aren't in Nicaea at all, but they're buried deep inside the pages of the Hebrew Bible and ancient Jewish thought? That's what we're going to do. We're going to approach this whole thing like a detective story, following the evidence all the way back in time.
Okay, so before we can even start looking for clues, we have to get one thing straight, and this is absolutely crucial. What did ancient Israelites actually mean by the word monotheism? Because if we get this part wrong, we are going to misunderstand everything that comes after.
So today, when we hear monotheism, we think of a simple numbers game. There is only one God, period, and a story. But that's us looking at it through a modern lens. Biblical monotheism, that was different. It didn't necessarily deny the existence of other spiritual beings. The Bible calls them Elohim in Hebrew. Instead, it was all about affirming YWH's absolute total uniqueness and his supreme authority over them. He alone is uncreated. He alone is sovereign. You have to imagine their worldview as this populated spiritual cosmos, and YWH was its one and only undisputed king.
Okay, so with that framework in our minds, now we can start looking for the clues. And we're going to start exactly where it all began, in the Hebrew Bible itself, what Christians call the Old Testament.
This timeline here, it's like a roadmap for this whole journey. And notice something really important. The Council of Nicaea isn't the beginning of the story at all. It's actually the end of a long, long development of thought that starts more than 1,000 years earlier.
All right, here's our first major clue. It's this mysterious figure called the Angel of YHW. Now, just watch what happens in this passage from Genesis. The angel finds Hagar and starts speaking to her, but then the voice suddenly shifts. The angel starts speaking as God in the first person, saying, "I will surely multiply your offspring." And Hagar's reaction? It's unmistakable. She calls the name of Yahweh who spoke to her. She knew she had just encountered God himself.
And this wasn't just a one-time weird thing. This pattern shows up again and again. The angel appears as a distinct figure, yet he speaks and acts with the full authority of God. He even does things like swear oaths by himself, something only God has the right to do. He carries God's own name, which in ancient Hebrew thought meant he carried God's very presence and identity. So you have this figure who is somehow both distinct from God and yet, in some deep, mysterious way, is God.
And this mysterious second divine figure isn't just limited to the angel. No way. The Hebrew Bible's actually filled with these kinds of clues. Let's look at just a couple more that would have really made an ancient reader scratch their head.
So, you've got Psalm 110, where Yahweh is talking to another figure he calls My Lord, and invites him to sit at his right hand, to share his divine throne. And then, even more mind-blowing, you have Daniel 7, which describes a son of man who rides the clouds of heaven, something only Yahweh does, and he receives eternal worship from all peoples. You can just imagine an ancient scribe reading this stuff and thinking, wait, who are these guys? And this right here, is the question that unlocks the entire mystery. Remember, these weren't Christian texts yet. They were Jewish scriptures. So how on earth did Jewish theologians in the centuries before Christianity even began make sense of all this? Well, they developed a theological framework that scholars today call two powers in heaven. And this idea right here is the crucial missing link in that common narrative we talked about, the one that says the Trinity was just invented out of thin air. So what exactly was it? Well, to put it simply, it was a recognized Jewish way of thinking about a second divine power, a figure who was distinct from God the Most High, but who shared his very name and authority. And crucially, this was not seen as a violation of monotheism. It was seen as a faithful way to understand what their own scriptures were saying. And this wasn't some fringe idea either.
It was widespread. In really popular pre-Christian Jewish texts like the Book of Enoch, that Son of Man from Daniel is a pre-existent heavenly being who comes to judge the world. You see it in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which describe a divine Melchizedek figure. And the famous Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria wrote all about the Logos, or the Word of God, as the agent of creation. This all just shows that the idea of a second divine power was a live, debated, and serious option within Judaism itself.
So, if this was a Jewish idea, what happened? What changed everything? Well, the answer comes down to one person, Jesus of Nazareth.
Here's how it all went down. Early Christians, who were, remember, all Jewish, they looked at their scriptures, and then they looked at Jesus, a man who was forgiving sins, accepting worship, and calling himself the Son of Man. And for them, the pieces just clicked into place. They made the connection. They identified Jesus as this second divine figure they had been reading about for centuries. And as soon as that specific identification was made, everything changed. Rabbinic Judaism, in an effort to create a clear boundary against this new movement, basically rejected the two powers framework completely and for the first time labeled it a heresy.
And this, at long last, brings us back to Nicaea. See, with all this history in mind, that council starts to look very, very different. It's not the beginning of the story at all. It's more like a final, crucial clarification.
The problem at Nicaea wasn't whether Jesus was divine, but how he was divine. There was this teaching going around called Arianism, and it argued that Jesus was the first and greatest created being, but still a creature. He was like God, but not truly God in his essence. And the council's response was crystal clear. They declared that the Son is of the same essence as the Father. This was their way of drawing a very bold line in the sand. They were saying that Jesus isn't a created being, no matter how exalted. He wasn't a magnificent creature. He was, and always had been, on the Creator's side of that line.
So this is the main takeaway. Nicaea wasn't about inventing a new god or turning a man into a deity. It was actually a deeply conservative move. It was designed to preserve what they believed was the ancient biblical teaching about the Son's full divinity, a teaching with roots that stretched all the way back into how ancient Jews interpreted their own scriptures.
And that leaves us with one final, fascinating question to think about. The story of the Trinity is so often told as a story of Christianity breaking away from its Jewish roots. But what if it's the exact opposite? What if this doctrine, instead of being a Greek corruption, is actually the culmination of a theological conversation that began centuries earlier, right in the heart of Judaism itself? It's a shift in perspective that really does change the entire story. Thanks for exploring this with me.